Hello, I have come with a very important project today. Have you ever, at all, been like, this dress from way back when used to fit me, but you know, I just fluctuate my weight so much. And you thought, oh, it'd be so great to have like a corset back to adjust. Well, it's your lucky day. We're doing that. Putting this in, replacing that zipper, and you'll have an adjustable dress. Let's get started. All right, so we're just gonna get started by taking this whole zipper out. And I will say the easiest thing to do is get one of these, they're just called Corset inserts. And I got this off Amazon, and they have many different colors, many different sizes. And we just get this instead of making it, because making them are kind of hard. So we're just gonna install this instead. So I'm just trying to find these little threads that are kind of peeking out on this side. That way I can just get like one hole all the way through like that. And then I just kind of rip down the line and kind of pull apart. And hopefully we can rip the thread, and that'll make this process go much easier. But you see, if I seam rip both sides, just by doing that, it'll take both of them out. Make it much easier. And I'm going on the sequin side because in case I'm not, but just in case I rip any holes, it's going to be much harder to actually see, and we can more easily fix it than this lining that's very thin. One side is done. The bottom can be a little tricky, so I'm going to take this a little bit slower. It looks like they put this, this kind of thin netting material that's small. It's just kind of like a stabilizer in between the fabrics, because this has some kind of stretch and give to it, and so does the lining. So it helps it not move around as you sew. So we might try to use this on our own to kind of use the same method they did when they put this in. But it is totally not necessary, but it will certainly make sewing easier. Okay, and we'll want to remove any hardware, just like this hook. And then we'll do the eye on the other side. Okay. Probably should have mentioned, yeah, you do want to be careful when you're making something, taking something out to make it bigger, because then we can't really hide any holes we made. But I promise you that wasn't as aggressive as it may have looked. Okay, now we are actually going to get to, pinning. So let's switch around to the corset. So we are going to install this just like you would a zipper. So we're going to start with the outside first, and then we'll attach the lining. So what we'll do is we're going to start up here. And now it is important to see where the fold is, because again, we don't necessarily want to make it smaller, like the fabric smaller. So where that crease is, that is where I want it to fold, with the loops just barely showing, and none of this like portion here is showing. So I'm just gonna kind of pin it on the edge there. Just to make sure when it folds over that you cannot see this edge showing. So this material here is pretty thick, what it's made out of. So if you look at this zipper here, it is pretty thin and it has like this mesh quality to it. So it makes it a lot more flexible. And that's probably why they added this little bit of kind of stabilizer before they put the zipper in. So since this material is thicker, it kind of acts as a stabilizer itself. So we're not gonna worry about putting that in. But if you are working, like if one of these is like pretty thin and feels thin like a zipper like this, that's when you probably will want to add some kind of stabilizer in before you sew. But we'll just kind of keep pinning all the way down and just checking to make sure it folds over nicely. And here you're going to see we have some extra at the bottom of the opening. We're just going to leave it down on the inside. You probably won't need to cut it out unless it creates like a bulky piece, but we will come back to that later once we see it put together. All right, so I've got the one side pinned like that. And so we're going to just do the same thing with the other piece on this side. So the difference with this one is it comes with this Modesty panel. Now you can choose what type you want. There are some kinds that just come with basically two pieces that look like this. Or most commonly, you'll want to get this Modesty panel because if it goes lower than the waist, you just want to make sure you can't see anything when you lace it all up. So I do recommend getting these because then, honestly, if you didn't want the Modesty panel, you could probably just cut it on that edge there and just use it, or even fold it like that and use it. So it's much more versatile. All right, so this one, how we're going to pin it is roughly the same. We do just basically not want to see their previous stitching lines for the lace loops. So our fold is going to want to just be kind of covering that on the edge there. Okay, so you can kind of already see this is going to be more of an issue because it is so wide. But again, we're just going to put it in. So as you can see, it folding over even with that amount that's kind of tucked under there, it does sit pretty nicely on this edge. So we're not going to worry about cutting any of this until we get to the lining part and see if there's an issue. So let's go over to the sewing machine. Okay, so we're going to start at this, at the very base of the zipper. And where I'm going to sew is actually going to be right on this edge here, kind of is my goal, just to help with this loop not show through. And some of my pins have already come out, so I'm just going to repin that real quick. Okay. And don't forget to back stitch as we sew. So I'm just using my inside area here of my foot as my guide of where I want this to sew on top of. And I would recommend going slow, especially if you're doing something with sequins like I am, just in case. These are more, they're like a softer kind of sequin. So, and the smaller the sequin and the more stretchy it is, they're typically easier to sew and aren't as prone to break your needles. That will be a helpful tip. And so, like I kind of talked to you earlier about the stabilizer, as I'm sewing, I am kind of pulling it taut. That way it's not still moving around, as you can see there. Any kind of pulling I'm feeling, because it is going over these like loops, it's creating a little bit of tension. So I'm just adjusting about every time I'm going over it if I feel it kind of move where I'm wanting to go. Okay, now we're at the top. And if we check to flip over, you'll see you cannot see that edge. Now we're starting on the other side here. Just checking to make sure my lining is out of the way. And again, I've got another guideline, as you can see, is that stitch line. So I'm gonna want to actually use my other edge, just so I have enough space. I'm gonna go on the right side of this inner part and kind of use that as my guide along the stitching that's there. That way you cannot see it on the other side. Okay, and this one can be a little bit harder to see, so I'm just kind of checking to make sure nothing is moving around, even with those pins in there. So as you're sewing, these little loop parts on the edge, that's what is kind of giving you tension because of that thickness. So that's why we're kind of adjusting as we go. You just kind of have to feel like right there, I know it's going over it, but sometimes it'll give you a little pushback. So we might need to adjust. But now we're coming to the end. So this part gets a little tricky because we have this connected part there. So I'm just making sure that's out of my way as I sew further down. I'm just gonna hold. Okay. And right where I'm holding, I'm going to do a back stitch. So I'm just going to go a little bit forward and right there. Now I'm going to double check that we didn't miss anything. So I'm just looking at the under inside because I see this kind of material likes to curl on itself. So I'm just making sure. I just kind of tug it to let it adjust, kind of sit as it wants to. And I can kind of feel the bulk that's sitting there, but it looks good. It's laying flat. This V part is not kind of bubbling or curving as it's kind of laying like that. So that looks good. And now we're going to go back over to the table and pin the lining. Okay. So we've got a couple options here actually, closing up this lining. The cheater's way, you could honestly do it all by hand, which I'm not opposed to, especially if it's very hard on the inside. But because just the way it folds over, it's all nice and pressed already because we ripped out that zipper. And you could just honestly whip down the edge really nice and none would be the wiser. It would look gorgeous. But I'll do this the harder way. That way, if you want to know, well, you'll know. Okay, another way you could actually do it is top stitch it down, especially with materials like this that it will be hard to see the top stitch. That is another option. You could honestly top stitch that down just to close up the lining a lot easier. But we're going to go inside and that's what we're going to decide what to do. Because we can do it the normal way. And thankfully this lining is open, so I can just pull it straight through and see it. So the third option we have is to do it like you would a normal zipper, closing the lining up. You would have to flip this outer shell over here. Now, what's preventing me from doing this though to match up those side seams all the way down is the fact that this waist seam is tacked to the lining all the way around. If you really wanted to, we can remove that to flip it and sew it down. And honestly, that would be the easiest way, because then you can just go back in, and if you can kind of see, it's honestly just top stitched down. So that's not a big deal. We can always put that back. So that is the third option, and I think we'll do it just for the sake of cleanliness and it to look really nice, because the other options are pretty straightforward, which is pinning it down as it's folded and just top stitching all the way down. And the other option being kind of the same thing, but hand stitching it all the way down. So we're gonna do this the hard way by removing this stitch here far enough open to where we can fold it over and sew it more easily. So let's get started on that. That right there is the waist seam on the inside. So there is this seam here that we can try to pull apart again, but I'm just taking out as much as I need. Honestly, you could go all the way around, because you just top stitch it back. If you can kind of see, it's got this edge is split open and it's just stitched to this side, it looks like. So that should be pretty easy actually to put back. And yeah, we're gonna lose a little bit of sequins in this process. Okay, I'm just gonna see how much allowance that gave me. So now you can see this opening is much wider, which will allow me to kind of fold that over, which looks like that will be enough. If you can see, there's no kind of stress on the pulling there. So now we're just gonna pin this side on. So when we are pinning, we just kind of want to look at which side is the most beneficial to kind of sew on. And I'm thinking it'll be this side, so I can at least see where I have already previously stitched. So now I'm going to kind of flip back and forth here, but we're going to kind of match up our waist seam. So that is that outer waist seam line and that inner. I'm just going to place, I want this edge to kind of sit on that stitch line that we have just sewn on. So I'm letting that already creased area kind of sit there, and now I'm just pinning straight through to keep it from moving around. So we're going to do that all the way from the top to the bottom, because as you can kind of see, the seam allowance here, it varies in different places. So I'm just going by the fold line instead of that seam allowance that we've got. It's a very slight crease, just to keep it in place. Okay, and if you can kind of see the lining bottom is a little bit sewn higher than this opening at the outer edge. So what you can do is, instead of making our opening shorter, because we like this width, I'm gonna separate a little bit more of the lining layer so that it'll fit the outer a little bit better. Okay, so I'll put one last pin in on that side. and that one will be good to sew. So now let's just look at the other side before we go to the sewing machine. Okay, so now we'll have to flip it the other way. You see this big opening at the bottom of this section? This is how you can easily get to the other side, by pushing that out. And then we're going to see the other side of the zipper. Voila. So now, as you can maybe already tell, that waist seam on this side is preventing it from fully opening. So again, we're going to open up this side of the waist seam. So we'll just do the same thing. It looks like on the reverse side here is going to be the better place to sew, because again, I can see where I have sewn a little bit better. So we're going to do the same process on this side by matching that creased edge of the lining to where our stitch line is. And then, yeah, let's start with the waist seam, because it helps this lay better if we start with the waist seam to go ahead and pin. Matching that up. Okay. Okay, now that we're at the bottom, you're going to notice that this, the Modesty panel, all that extra fabric is going to get in our way. It's not going to lay as straight because this is too much. So we're not going to do anything just yet. We are going to sew both sides, but what I'll have you do is, with the Modesty panel, we will leave probably about an inch or maybe 2 inches. So I'm just going to keep those double pins in there to kind of show me where to stop when I'm sewing, because we want to leave about an inch or 2 opening at the very bottom, just to see, once everything's sewn, we'll flip it out and it'll give me a better view of where we need to cut, because that whole panel is going to be an issue, but we'll address that once everything's sewn. So let's go over to the machine. We're going to start here, but before we start, because it's really hard to see our line that we sewed just on that edge, because as you can see right there, that's our line. I want to make sure we're sewing with the needle to the inside of our stitch line. That way the lining doesn't overlap what we've already sewn. But down here, it's really hard to see. So I'm actually going to grab a piece of chalk and just with your finger kind of flip open the seam that you've got, and on the edge just kind of trace a chalk line, just to a little bit more easily see where we sewed on this part. So in case you're working with material like this, or really the hardest thing to sew with is black, because it just blends in much. Like, it's different than white thread on white, because you can still kind of see it because of the shadows, but black thread on black fabric with shadows just makes it really hard to see. So we're just kind of tracing where our line was so that it'll make it easier to know where to sew. So this is our side with the opening. So I'm actually going to place my needle down into the fabric, take both pins out, and then we will do a little bit of a back stitch here. And so now I'm having this side of the foot line up with the chalk line that we just drew. Okay, and now you can just trace our previous stitching line. Okay, this gives a little bit of resistance, so I'm just flattening out the fabric. Okay, and now this lining I noticed has very small seam allowance here, so I'm just going to make sure by pulling it a little bit more just to make sure it catches. And again, I'm using my finger kind of as placement for that. And I'm just pulling out again that material so it lays flatter. Okay. I'm going to check one more time. Just make sure it'll catch. Okay. And I'm just going to flip underneath, and you see we've caught that little edge there. So that looks good, and we will go to the other side. So we're back over from the sewing machine. This side, same process as the other, we just sewed it all the way down instead of leaving the opening. And now I've got it flipped back inside out with the lining as my outer shell, so we can take a look at this bottom edge. So remember, your Modesty panel will go on top on the inside. So I'm just going to move it over so we can kind of see how that wants to sit. So as you can see, if I just tuck that in, we have this issue with it bunching. So the simplest solution I'm seeing is if we actually open up this lining seam until this lays flat, and then we'll actually just sew it all the way down on the inside. So now I'll just go ahead and start seam ripping. And now that we're seeing how it lays, we can honestly go back in and just sew that down. Again, if you wanted to hand sew this part, you really could. But we're going to go on the inside once again. And I'm just going to, with my hand here, I'm going to grab the seam allowance, the edge, and then I'm just going to kind of sandwich all that so I can pull it out as it wants to sit. And now we'll pin that and we'll take a look at the other side and see if we can do the same thing to kind of close it up at the bottom. So again, where we sewed it was, remember that fold and on that edge there. So I'm pinning it to match how we sewed it on that bigger opening. And then, if you notice, we will actually be able to just stitch this continuously down so it'll fall much more nicely. So you'll see where you stopped sewing at this bottom part, and that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to put a pin straight through And it's going to be kind of bulky because that's where all those seams meet. And so check on this side. That is the opening we had that we can close up a little bit further. Okay, and with that, the inside will sit a lot more nicely. So we're gonna go back to the sewing machine and we're just gonna close up this section here and then we'll be all set. Now that we're back at the sewing machine, we're gonna sew up this remaining closing edge that we left open first, and then we will switch to that side. So I'm just lining up where I stopped, and we'll back stitch. And so right where this bulkiness is where I'm gonna stop. You might just have to kind of feel it, but we're gonna fold that back. And again, I'm sewing it over that crease that is kind of there. And so that's the edge, and I'm just feeling kind of where this wants to flip up, and that's my stopping point. So we'll back stitch, stop, and then I'm gonna flip to this side that we just pinned. And again, it'll be really bulky, so you might just need to adjust accordingly. I'm gonna put my needle down, take my pin out, and then we'll sew. Might have to go slow over that since it's bulky to backstitch. All right, now that it is all closed up, we are ready to do the last finishing details. So now we're back over at the table, and as you can see, that now lays really nicely on the inside. And so our last step, we're going to move up at the top, and we're going to see how it sits. So this is the part where honestly you might want to try it on and lace it up to see where it gets tightened to, because sometimes maybe you only need about 2 inches of space. But just for the sake of it, we're going to do it here with this very wide panel, and I'm just going to attach a snap on the inside and on the Modesty panel so that when you're lacing up, you'll snap it and it'll be easier to lace all the ribbon through. We are just going to do a little mark here of where I want that snap, and then just so we make sure that's straight across, I'm just going to line that up to there, and we'll sew our snaps on. I'll just put the center there. Now you can use different size snaps. Usually you'll want a bigger one because it'll just be a little bit stronger. But you might notice when you do lace up this corset that you'll need a couple different placements for the snap, because as you get it tighter, you might need to move it more in or out. So if you wanted to make it adjustable, you'd place this same style snap on this side and you could place them about maybe an inch further down, closer to the inside of the inside bodice. For other variations, you could also use a hook and eye instead of a snap if you don't like how bulky it looks. I find that the snap just is a little bit stronger than the hook and eye, but you could always try both and see what works best for you. I always like to use this side of the snap with this little protruding bit on the part that sits against the body. So we've got the body will sit on this side. That way this part here doesn't dig into the skin. I just find in case for whatever reason you don't like anything like adjustable straps, anything that's like temporarily used, usually you use them with snaps. And if you place it on the piece that is removable, that means once they're not on the garment, it won't be poking you with how tight the dress is, because that just gets really uncomfortable. All right, that is the snap, and we are ready to go lace it up on the mannequin. So now you can see I've got her all laced up and she looks great, feels great, I'm assuming. But some couple customized things I just want to note of is, again, the snap placement. So my snap placement is there and you can see it kind of gets bunchy. So this is what I mean when you put it on. You'll be able to tell if it needs like a second button, a hook and eye, just to let it sit a little bit more straight. But how I like to lace it is I start at the top, I get to pull real tight, and then I just tuck the ties in at the bottom because I don't like the look of a bow there. But again, you can just experiment with the placement of how you want to tie it. If you don't like the look of a bow up here or even down here, you can always just tuck in the ribbon pieces down there, and that's when you might have to shorten the ribbon pieces so they don't show through. But that's really it. So if you want to like, subscribe, and comment down below, we'll see you in the next one.